Hi, I'm Kelsey, and I'm going to present my movie analysis paper. I watched the movie Still Alice. Still Alice is about, she's very young, she's 50 years old, happily married, very wealthy. She's a professor, has her PhD. She's a linguistic professor. So a lot of what the movie showed her when she, in the beginning, her presenting her projects to classes and big groups of people was a lot of her talking about the language and how we develop from year infants to 3 years, 3 years to 5 years, and how we linguistically change and learn. Um, she was 50 years old, married, very wealthy. Her husband was a lawyer, I think. Three grown children. She has grandchildren. Um, she starts finding herself not being able to remember words or part of her presentations, and she's done this forever. She's very passionate about her work. So she goes to the doctor thinking she's got a brain tumor, like something's wrong. After running a bunch of tests, she did this alone without telling her husband. She is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. After this, she tells her husband, and she can't believe it. She thinks this is wrong. You know, she's this well educated. She's 50 years old. What 50-year-old gets Alzheimer's? And they set their three grown children down and tell them, and it ends up being a genetic disease or deal of Alzheimer's. And so 2 out of her 3 kids choose to get tested to see if they have the gene. One does not have the gene. One's test comes back and it has the gene, and the third didn't want to know. So they all kind of dealt with it in their own way. In the beginning, I mean, her Alzheimer's was bad, but it wasn't like detrimental to her health yet. I mean, it was early onset Alzheimer's, but it wasn't horrible yet. And so each of the kids were kind of like, okay, we're going to deal with this. And a lot of, in the beginning, because it's like uncharted waters, they're trying to learn how to navigate. They have no idea, you know, their mom is 50 years old. They're supposed to have their mom's mind around for a while after that. I went through the slides and I figured out how to connect this movie to a lot of what we've learned. And because it was like, well, first of all, communications, interpersonal communications, it was hard for Alice to start communicating with her family. So her family, you know, had to learn how the dad had to kind of communicate more with the kids and stuff. And it was really hard for them to get any kind of communication down once her health deteriorated. But in the first chapter, we talked about the interpersonal imperative, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So at the bottom of that triangle is like the physical, your self-esteem, the stuff that, you know, we need, like sex and stuff. But the most abstract was self-actualization, and that was like the feeling of I'm doing something to contribute. And as she progressed and couldn't give her speeches anymore, and her research was gone, and she'd been researching for as a linguistic professor to, you know, to keep learning, she found herself like she thought she had no purpose, you know, like all her life's work that she had worked for this PhD in linguistics to like share what she had learned for all this time was gone. There was no, so that self-actualization, like she didn't have that anymore, and we really need that in order to like keep moving and like, you know. Chapter 2 is a lot about the self. How we see ourselves depends on the culture in which we live. Because they were so wealthy, both of them, you know, very well educated, their kids were all well off, you know, she's 50 years old, she could retire soon. Her self-esteem when she was there in her mind and her Alzheimer's hadn't completely taken over was horrid. She quit. You can kind of see like the movie like shows her progressively getting worse, not only because of the Alzheimer's, but because she's so frustrated with not being able to do her regular things. She doesn't want to put on makeup anymore, you know, so they kind of show the deterioration of that self-esteem because of the Alzheimer's. Chapter 4 talked a lot about symbolic abilities. Language can foster personal growth, and I think that was really hard for her. Because her 3 kids were grown, she really threw herself into her work. She kind of like, I don't want to say lost it, but she really had a hard time like not being able to do her research anymore with her linguistics. She lost a lot of who she was and was really frustrated. Chapter 6 was a lot about like listening, mindful listening, non-listening, the different types that we can do, being an active listener. Adapting to listening to communication, there was a lot of adapting. The 3 kids in the beginning were, including the husband, I think his name was John, were super frustrated at the fact that like their mom was no longer their mom. So they had to figure out a different way to communicate, and they weren't communicating with the same super highly educated, could remember raising her 3 kids kind of mom. So in the beginning, they're so frustrated, and Alice is frustrated too. You know, she wants to communicate the way she used to. So one thing I took from that side was careful expressions of judgment. In the beginning, the husband, I don't want to say it was judgmental, I think it was more frustrating, but to let Alice see that frustration in their barrier to communication, I think was hard for her. An example of that, or an expression of that non-listening, mindful listening communications, you could express support. And I think as they kind of like got more into a groove, into realizing that their mom, there's no way that she's going to get better, there's no cure to Alzheimer's, they were able to express support a lot more than what they were doing. But I do get that, because it was frustrating. I can't imagine that. Because of this external problem that this family was dealing with, there was a lot of diversity in the relationships after this. Not that there wasn't before, but it really like made some challenges arise. And then another thing I thought was neat was defining interpersonal conflicts. So express disagreement, frustration. I don't think it was as much as a disagreement, like a disagreement between 2 people. It was like the frustration. So they had to learn how to deal with this external conflict and what kind of it brought on to the family. And a lot of that was expressed through frustration. And then the last 2 was nature of friendships, and then communication in families and romantic relationships, friendships and romantic relationships. So I know like mother-daughter, mother-son, it isn't a friendship. I mean, when you get older, you're not parenting as much, so it's more of a friendship. But the nature of friendships, 2 of those bullet points were willingness to invest and emotional closeness. So I think in the beginning, because they had their own lives going on, one of her daughters was pregnant, it was really hard to like invest. Like they would just get frustrated when they would talk to their mom, so it was frustrating for them to invest their time. That emotional closeness was lost for a little bit because they felt like they couldn't connect to her on a cognitive level. If you can't connect cognitively, it can be kind of hard to get close, I think. And they saw their mom deteriorating. Another thing, Alice and John, it was his name, her husband, there's 3 levels to the development in a romantic relationship, and they'd been married for, they had 3 grown kids, they have grandchildren, they lived this happy life. It was growth, navigation, and deterioration. I think they were at the navigation point. Their 3 kids had moved out, started their own lives. They're starting to get into their groove of, the retirement phase, the empty nesters. I don't think their relationship was deteriorating yet. I mean, they had their struggles, and they had a new norm to kind of get into the flow of. And I think as they watched Alice progressively get worse in her disease, they knew that the inevitable was coming. But the navigation, I thought, was a good word. They were navigating uncharted waters as a family between those relationships, mother-daughter, mother-son, but also as husband and wife. They were navigating this new thing, and they knew kind of how the road was going to end. Communication in families was huge. That was our last chapter, communication in families. I think the word I keep using is frustration, because they had to learn how to, communicate as a family now. And I think the bonds, as you like watch the movie progress, the bonds between father and son, like all of his father, daughter, his 3 kids, got a lot stronger because they could all bond over something like this, horrible like this. And I think once they all kind of realized, like, hey, this is something that we have to, work with, I don't want to say deal with, but like learn how to, this is our new normal, and she can only really get worse, so we can try to prolong it as long as we can. But yeah, Still Alice was a good movie, and I think it related a lot to what we were learning about in class, interpersonal communications.